Hi everyone, I'm January Contreras, and I'm glad to be joining you today with the Maricopa County Democratic Party and their candidates for Maricopa County Attorney. We're proud to have 3 qualified candidates to choose from in the primary election, which is on August 4th this year. I will be doing a mini interview with all 3 candidates, Bob McWhorter, Julie Gunnigal, and Will Knight. I hope you enjoy learning more about all 3 candidates, and especially how much this office impacts our lives and our community. Thank you. So it's good to see you, Bob.
Good to see you too.
We have the chance today to let the voters learn more about you and what your leadership would mean to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office and the people of Maricopa County. I will ask you 4 questions that I'm discussing with everyone, but first we'll let you get a chance to introduce yourself to voters.
Well, thank you. My name is Bob McWhorter, and I'm running for Maricopa County Attorney. The job of the Maricopa County Attorney is to make you safer from crime. It's to effectively prosecute people who commit crimes. This is an office of some 140 trial attorneys at any given time who are supposed to be dedicated to prosecuting what is now some 30,000 cases a year comes out of that office. That being said, mass incarceration does not make us safe from crime. The criminalization of addiction and mental health problems do not make us safe from crime. The prosecution of low-level marijuana offenses makes nobody safer from crime and is bad public policy. All of these things not only do not make us safer from crime, they're terrible for the taxpayer and a terrible way of treating people who sometimes have underlying problems that should be treated with something other than the criminal justice system. So when you focus on these issues and what needs to be done, the issue in this race is criminal justice reform. We have the first time in 40 years to bring together the forces and people that need to come together to implement true criminal justice reform to the benefit of not just defendants and offenders, but also taxpayers and victims, and to make you safer from crime by being smart and punishing people smart, not just punishing people for the sake of increasing the prison population. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. So we'll talk about 4 areas that sometimes we don't get enough time to hear from you about. And we're going to start with plea policies at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So as you and I know, there are certain policies in place that mandate what plea agreements can and cannot happen. Based on your own experience and your interaction with prosecutors and judges and defense attorneys, can you tell us, if you were to choose 3 of those policies that are currently in place around plea agreements, which 3 would you say most urgently need to be reviewed for change? And how do you think that would make a difference for the county?
Well, I think you can make great differences in the county. What you're talking about is fundamentally changing culture around what needs to be done and the way offenses need to be prosecuted. To be specific as to 3 policies among many things you should review, I will start with number 1, these policies of so-called plead to the lead. These were policies that were kind of thrown out to look tough on crime that actually don't make anybody safer. And the policy is, oh, when you're charged with something, you have to plead to the biggest charge in the indictment and not a lesser charge. And of course, the trouble with that is, a lot of times these indictments are written months before anything really happens in the case, and new facts get known and new situations get known, and it creates a rigidity that is simply leads to injustice. So that's policy number 1 I would look to change. I would also look to change Hannah priors. Now, this is where the prosecutor can decide to stack a charge on top of another charge, usually of incidents, things that happen at the very same instance. And it's an artificial way for the prosecutor to usurp the role of the legislature by creating more punitive sentences in a way that's just fundamentally unfair and doesn't lead to any justice. There was a bill that came out of the legislature last year to change this. It was a bipartisan bill, had huge support. The former county attorney, Maricopa County Attorney, went to the governor after the session was over and got the governor to veto that bill. Day one, I can implement the effect of that bill in the office. Now realize, this is the largest prosecution office in the state. 62 to 64% of everybody who goes to the Department of Corrections comes out of Maricopa County, the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. So this can have a profound effect on not only the taxpayer of Maricopa County, but the state's taxpayer as well. The other plea issue that I would look at is the charging of mandatory minimums. And all of these are related and work together. But what that means is, you know, a given incident happens, and a person can be charged 3, 4, sometimes 5 different ways for the exact same offense. Well, each of those has their own mandatory minimums, which means the prosecutor decides how somebody's going to be sentenced before a judge has anything to do with it. I would de-emphasize the use of mandatory charging. This all fundamentally goes down to what needs to be done to create more justice and fairness, which is give judges back discretion. Judges need to make the decisions as to where and how people should be sentenced, because they have to take in many different factors, and they're more free from political influences, and that can create more justice. And by the way, judges are not people, they tend to be conservative people, so they're not going to be giving away the store. But the system that should be functioning correctly means judges decide sentences, not the prosecutors. And that is a way to create more fairness in the system and eliminate the rigidity, so that line prosecutors can actually do something and work and respond to a situation that may need some justice, which can't be done now under these rigid plea policies. So that would be that in a nutshell. So I'm sorry, I'm gonna go ahead and quote from Aristotle, because I can't help myself. Look, what Aristotle said is, it's the role of the judge to do what a legislator would have done had the legislator seen this particular case. Well, we've taken that role away, and we need to put that role back in. So sorry for those people who get kind of bugged at the true nerdiness stuff of that, but that's the system and the way it was supposed to be, and that's what we need to go back to. Thank you.
Thanks, Bob. So going to a different part of the office, talking about juvenile justice. In Arizona, like in many other places across the country, there is a school to prison pipeline. We see involvement in the juvenile justice system lead to involvement in the criminal justice system later on. And we know that there are ways that we can make that better. When you think about the juvenile justice system, you know, what is your vision to really make that work in Maricopa County? There are issues such as fines and fees that are being levied against juveniles and families, a lot of whom are low income, can't handle those fines and fees. We see in Arizona that juveniles can be taken to adult court in many instances in ways that, you know, it can be treated differently. What would you say in terms of those issues that your vision is for the juvenile justice system, and how do we make it better?
Well, first of all, we have to start from the understanding that juveniles are fundamentally different than adults. Their brains are different. They haven't finished growing. And we know this. And, you know, the current interim county attorney and the recent former county attorney spent $500,000 of your taxpayer money in order to commission a study that is just simply bad science and bogus, to somehow say that children are just as responsible for adults in the criminal justice system, and therefore we should not account for that at all. Well, that's just simply wrong. I mean, ask any parent of a 16-year-old, and they'll tell you very clearly that's not the case. And if you need any other evidence, you know, just ask why insurance companies charge greater insurance for teenage drivers than they do for adult drivers, because they know that the juvenile brain is different. It's not grown up yet. That's the purpose of the juvenile system, and that's why it's centered on rehabilitation, letting the child come back in. It's centered on creating a system where people can come back into society after they've been grown up and developed a little bit. If you try to do that with a punitive model, it's bad policy, it's bad for people, and it doesn't make anybody safer, because you end up just putting children in with adults who are worse, and they're going to come out worse. That doesn't take a great deal of deep science to figure that one out. So what you really have to do is center this system on the idea of rehabilitation of children. And those fines, fees, and surcharges are fundamentally a regressive tax on the poor, because the poor kid can't afford to get out of that rock, from under that rock, and other kids with means can. And that's just simply is not just. And if the idea is to put people back in and integrate them in society, I think that's clear. Now, another thing that I think we need to focus on with this specific question is the elimination of transfer and automatic transfer. Now, unfortunately, there are some children who have been so damaged that they're not going to be able to function in society again, and you need to transfer them to adult court. But judges should make those decisions in a contested hearing where evidence is presented on both sides. You have cases now of children as young as 15 years old who, if they're charged with a certain offense, automatically go to adult court. Well, when I'm county attorney, that's going to happen very rarely, and I'm going to go to the legislature and argue to repeal those automatic transfer statutes. Because really, you have a process that allows for due process and justice and considerations when a judge makes that decision, rather than just having a prosecutor do it behind closed doors when all the political forces are saying that should happen. That's just an example of where we've done bad policy and it's made nobody really safer in the long run. And those things have to change and refocus juvenile justice, which is where it's supposed to be. And I tell you, I've represented many juveniles who really should have had a better chance than they got in this system.
How can you use data when you're leading the Maricopa County Attorney's Office? When we see issues like racial disparities in sentencing or in charging, or who's coming in the door, when we see trends about unlawful use of force that may be happening in any particular agency or for any particular person, how do you think that you can use, as the leader of Maricopa County Attorney's Office, data to really start to help tell the story of what's actually happening and to address those issues?
You know, for me, that question almost answers itself. We need to start by using data to determine all those things. The current interim county attorney, Alistair Dell, went to the legislature behind people's back and lobbied against a bill that would require prosecutors to record and mark that those data points. The bill required that they keep track of everybody who's sentenced, everybody who's charged, and the disposition of their cases by race, by kind of economic status, and just see where this is going. We don't know the specifics of the injustice in the system. We know it's unjust through other indicators and racially biased. But when you refuse to keep track of the numbers, that's just willful ignorance, and that's got to stop. And frankly, forget if there's a bill in the legislature or law. As Maricopa County Attorney, the first week I can order those statistics to be kept. That's just going to be office policy. Because how can we really identify the solutions to the problems if we don't have a clear understanding of the scope and breadth of the problem? That to me just seems like simple math to me, and we need to go forward and do that. So that would certainly be my commitment in terms of what to do with data and how to usually implement it. You know, all this goes back to a notion, it's not a bad notion, of evidence-based sentences. You can tell recidivism rates for certain crimes, certain circumstances, certain age groups, etc., and fashion sentences that provide the maximum necessary deterrent effect, the maximum punishment that's necessary, but also what's best for society and the taxpayer in terms of allowing people to reincorporate into society who we have a chance to save and not be a burden on society and not come out worse than when they went into the Department of Corrections. Those are the kind of things where you can use data. And frankly, you know, sometimes people throw up their hands about the criminal justice system. Oh, we can't solve these. No, we can solve these problems. But we need to do it by being smart on crime, not just running around saying we're going to punish everybody and end up with, you know, the 4th largest prison population in the country, even though we're only the 14th largest state.
Thank you, Bob. So the last question takes us to a completely different part of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. Many people don't realize that there's a whole civil division to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, where when we have a new leader come in, there's some real opportunity to also serve the people of Maricopa County. What is your vision for that civil division? What are your primary objectives?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. When people think about this office, if they haven't thought about it at all, they think it's like an episode of Law and Order. Well, they never had an episode of Law and Order that dealt with the county highway department, or fair, or compliance with the Board of Supervisors, or a number of the other civil events that have occurred. As many people may know, I wrote the bar complaint against Andrew Thomas, a former county attorney who was infamous. One of the things he did was he fired most of the people in the civil division so he could farm that work out to his cronies in the private bar. And that was just a total misuse of taxpayer money. So I think that's very clear to make sure that this is not going to be a subject of cronyism or favoritism for certain private attorneys. There are many things that are done much better in-house and much more efficient for the taxpayer, and understand the scope of this. This is part of the reason why this office has over 1,000 employees. You need an attorney with real experience to be able to manage this kind of thing. One of the things in my background is I spent a year in El Salvador administering $11.2 million U.S. aid package to reform the courts, the police, the justice system, which is exactly the kind of administrative experience that you need to run an office of this breadth and scope. And to have any notion that, like certain county attorney is going to be the personal civil rights attorney for the county sheriff is just an absurd notion. That's not the nature of the job. The nature of the job is to make sure this is done with justice and fairness, and that the taxpayer is served by these civil functions just as much as they're served by the criminal functions. And I'll give just one more example of the inappropriate use of ideology and politics in this that I think was appalling. The former county attorney decided that he did not personally believe in same-sex adoptions. Now, adoptions for people of modest means, the county pays for that, for the legal services. And it's a simple reason for that, which is it's much less expensive for the taxpayer to have a child adopted rather than have them spend decades in the foster care system and at the public expense. So adoption is one of the best alternatives to social problems that exist. So that's why we make sure those legal fees are covered for people who can't afford attorneys otherwise. Well, it was decided that since the former county attorney didn't like same-sex adoptions, didn't think they were right, they violated his religious proclivities, that he would have the county not do them. And that was just wrong. He was taken to court. He lost all over the place. And that is the kind of misuse of public policy for a political end in the civil division that will not occur when I'm Maricopa County Attorney.
Thank you, Bob. Do you want to take a minute or two just to summarize, why you're running and what your leadership means for the county?
Well, thank you. And thanks again for this opportunity. Look, to have this office, you're asking the taxpayers to trust you. You're asking the voters to trust you. And for that, you need to have integrity. And integrity is crucial. The origin of the word integrity means the whole, like the word integer. It's related to the whole number, right? To have integrity, it's not just a question of having honesty about everything that you've done or ever in your past. It's also about having a sense of justice and what's right, and making sure that this is fair and balanced and takes into account. We're at a moment in our history right now where these issues are finally coming to a forefront with Black Lives Matter and the misabuse of police power. This is just a simple question of integrity, and that's what this moment is. When you talk about people protesting, and I'll just give one example. You talk about people protesting, and sometimes people throw up, well, people are looting, they're committing crimes, all that. Isn't that terrible? My response to that is, yeah, that's a false equivalency. There are people who commit crimes. Looting is a crime that should be prosecuted. But the systematic injustice done to persons of color in this country, to the point where a man is suffocated to death with the knee of a police officer, That is not just a crime, that is a crime against humanity. And we shouldn't be talking about those two things in even the same conversation at all. As Maricopa County Attorney, I will never forget the difference between those two.
Okay, Julie, good to see you.
Oh, it's so good to see you.
Okay, so we have this chance for voters to learn more about why the county attorney's office is so important, as we all know, and also who are the attorneys that are stepping forward to lead. So what we'll do at this time is I will ask you a set of questions that we're asking all the candidates, but we'll start by giving you a chance to introduce yourself to the voters who have tuned in. Why do you want to lead the county attorney's office, and what your leadership means?
Sure. Well, welcome voters who are tuning in. My name is Julie Gunnigal. I was born, raised, and educated in the Valley. I am a mom of 3, and I am a former prosecutor of politicians. I hold a BS in chemistry from NAU and a law degree with honors from Notre Dame. And I started out my career as a small town prosecutor. I was later tapped to join the Financial Crime and Public Corruption Unit in Cook County, where I prosecuted politicians and corporations who broke the law and stole taxpayer money. I'm going on my 14th year of practice this year, and I am more devoted than ever to the causes related to justice. But I came to running for office, and I came to meet January in a very different way. You see, I have a child who is not neurotypical, but is also profoundly gifted. And when we put him in school here, the very same preschools and public schools that I attended as a child, I quickly discovered how under-resourced Arizona had become. After he'd been to 9 different schools before 2nd grade, we realized that the education system here isn't what it once was, and that Arizona had stopped investing in its people. So, I mean, together we went down to the Capitol, sat in hearings, we marched with the teachers, and what I discovered was that Arizona has changed. Our legislature can openly vote money into their own pockets. They can vote on legislation that impacts companies that they own, and they do it with legal impunity. I don't believe that we have placed the emphasis that we should on fighting public corruption. And moreover, we haven't done enough to combat the corruption and, by extension, the racial disparities that destroy lives inside our criminal justice system. Make no mistake about it, there is big money in hate, and for years, the private prison industry has worked to keep Arizonans, and particularly Arizonans of color, locked up. I believe that the state should fund public school instead of private prison, that we should put education and families first, but that we can't get there and do lasting criminal justice reform without addressing first the corruption in our system. I do hope that you'll learn more about me and my platform. Please visit gunnigal2020.com or on Twitter at Julie Gunnigal. I'm so pleased to be able to share my platform with you.
Thanks, Julie, for the introduction. So we're going to talk about 4 different topics that hopefully will give voters an idea of why the Maricopa County Attorney's position is so important, and why, when we have this opportunity to bring in new leadership, that we want to know, what priorities are people coming in with. And so the first question is about plea policies. We know that here at the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, there are many different, very strict plea policies that are in place in terms of how cases are handled. Based on your interaction with prosecutors and defense attorneys and judges and others, tell us about 3 plea policies that you feel are most important to review for urgent change. And what result do you think changing those policies will have for the county?
Ooh, January, that is such a good question. Plea policies are at the heart of criminal justice reform. So for those who might not understand why, we live in a state that has moved toward mandatory minimum sentences and has adopted a policy deceptively named truth in sentencing. And this has served to shift the power from judges and prosecutors, from judges to the prosecutors in our system. So for those who have never experienced our criminal justice system, it is so tempting to think of it as a defense attorney going up against a prosecutor and a judge at the top overseeing all of it to make sure that justice is done. But that's not how it works. Mandatory minimums take a lot of that power from the judges and they give it to prosecutors such that the outcome of a case is really determined at charging rather than, during discovery or trial. So first, I believe that we should address mandatory minimums in pleas by charging around those minimums, by creating diversion programs that provide treatment in lieu of a conviction. And it's also a way of directing people to rehabilitation rather than to costly incarceration programs that don't make us any safer. Secondly, we need to get rid of the trial tax. Our justice system, as you know, is based around the idea that people are able to test the government's evidence at trial. And it used to be true that between 5 or 10% or more of all the cases in our criminal justice system went to trial. But now that number is closer to 1%. And it's because this office uses what's called a trial tax. That is, prosecutors will argue for a longer, harsher sentence if they obtain a conviction by a trial rather than by plea. And it drives up the risk to defendants not to go to trial, and it forces pleas. Third, I believe we need to eliminate cash bail. And I know that this is not, strictly speaking, a plea policy, but being held on unattainable cash bail is the greatest predictor of whether or not someone will plead guilty and receive a longer sentence. We know that cash bail doesn't serve the purposes for which it was intended. That is, securing attendance at future court dates. Instead, it punishes poverty and it destroys lives. At 24 hours, someone who is held on unattainable cash bail is likely to lose their job. At a week, they're likely to lose their housing, and at months, they lose their family. I am committed to stop asking for cash bail. And if someone presents that real risk of flight or danger of release, then present that evidence and get detention orders rather than asking for unattainable cash bail. I am moved by the morality of plea reform, as I believe that these policies that drive Arizona to be the 5th largest incarcerator in our country and 8th largest in the world. But if you're not moved by the humanity of this situation, consider being moved by the cost. Our incarceration machine costs $1.2 billion per year, and it doesn't make us safer. I think it is well past time to get our priorities straight and to reinvest in Arizona. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. Talking about a different way that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office impacts families, students, all of us in Maricopa County is the juvenile justice system. When it comes to the juvenile justice, I don't think it gets enough attention, the role that the county attorney's office can play. And
I think you're right.
Work in that space, serving a lot of juveniles. So tell us about, it plays a role in this school to prison pipeline that we hear so much about, that everyone knows there's something not right about that happening. What can you do as the county attorney to reduce fines and fees imposed on juveniles and families, the system overall, and specifically also, what do you see changing regarding the prosecution of minors in adult court, the way that we currently do it in Maricopa County?
I am so glad that we are talking about this. Let's start with the school to prison pipeline, because the truth of the matter is that it's a misnomer. It doesn't start in schools. It starts in birth with our maternal health care crisis, our non-existent parental leave, our under-resourced early childhood education programs, our lack of a social safety net, such that by the time a child arrives at one of our abysmally underfunded public schools, they're already deep within the pipeline. And this is equally true with the foster care to prison pipeline. So to answer your question, here's how a reform-minded county attorney can help. First, we can create restorative justice practices that address the harm that's caused to people and relationships and to the community, but also redirect youth out of the criminal justice system. These programs, when they are run well, are positively transformational. They reduce fines and fees, and they focus on undoing the harm and healing the child rather than punishment. Secondarily, when prosecutors have discretion, we can and should stop charging juveniles as adults. We know now more than ever how brains develop and how morally and now scientifically unjust those policies are. Additionally, we shouldn't be ever arguing for a juvenile life without parole. And I believe our prosecutors' offices should support those who are currently serving those sentences to be resentenced. And then last, people tend to forget that a reform-minded county attorney can also be an advocate down at the legislature. And I personally would be an advocate for raise the age legislation. That would be legislation that keeps juveniles in the juvenile system rather than the adult system for longer, to give more options for rehabilitation rather than incarceration. I also believe that too many Arizona students are in schools without nurses, without counselors, without other support. So districts should take a hard look at how they are policing students rather than teaching discipline and skills, and reconsider their use of SROs. It's also an education issue. There's a sad fact that 15% of all Americans are dyslexic, but nearly half of everyone who's incarcerated are. If we invested in education and OT in particular, and invested in these kids, we could all have a better outcome. My plans frees up about $250 million a year by divesting in incarceration. And while our county attorney doesn't get to spend that money, I would advocate for significant reinvestment in our schools and communities. There was a time where I taught in our 2 juvenile detention facilities. At that time, a majority of the children detained not only had that delinquency case, but also had a dependency case, meaning that their parents were alleged to not be fit or able to take care of them. And I remember one of those students asking me about the path to becoming an attorney. And he got elbowed so quickly by one of his friends who told him to shut up because he would never be going to school. And my point is that children in custody know from a very young age that they will not have the opportunity that so many others enjoy. As a mom, it is absolutely heartbreaking to see that someone who should have their entire life in front of them has already believed, for a good reason, that there is no hope. So we need to do better, and I'm committed to doing better.
Thank you, Julie. Let's talk about, some of the things that frustrate us about the justice system as it exists all over, but, particularly here in Maricopa County. We don't always have enough data, or if it's there, we don't hear enough about it. So tell us more about, how would you use data to help problem solve? How would you use data to identify and address racial disparities in sentencing, in charging, in who's coming in the door? How would you use data to address unlawful use of force? All these issues out there where, data can be powerful. Tell us about, if you were leading the county attorney's office, how would you do that?
My goodness, this really should be a couple-hour discussion, but let me see if I can do it in 3 minutes. First, I envision a county that ensures justice for all and respects the dignity of every person. And the racism that is in our criminal justice system is undeniable. At every stage of our system, we know that Black and Brown and Indigenous people are treated differently. This isn't an issue for which there are both sides. It is undeniable, it is wrong, it needs to stop. So my platform has a detailed plan of how to make it happen, and data plays a big part. So first, I want everyone watching to recognize that when cases get charged from this office, to this day, there is a box for an attorney to check that contains a slur for an undocumented person accused of a crime. So we should begin with race and ethnicity blind charging as a matter of principle. But I also don't think we should pretend that that solves the problem, because our problems are structural and they're deeply baked into the system. So it is my priority to be radically transparent and to open the books on this historically secretive office. And I am committed to using the Vera Institute model, which I know you're familiar with. It's nationally recognized as both a leading practice and one of the fastest routes to equity in prosecution. It involves opening the books on the office and addressing trends within the office, and doing it all under the supervision and with the involvement of the community. So to give you an example, we know that Black Arizonans are 3.9 times more likely to be convicted of marijuana possession than a white Arizonan. So from there, our solution is to stop charging low-level marijuana offenses. But there are trends in this office that we don't even know are happening because we're not looking for them. So for example, one office that went through this process opened their books and they discovered that for resisting arrest, for example, a shocking 77% of those who were charged were Black. And I believe that this office, if it's going to be explicitly anti-racist, that we only get there when we are looking for these trends, and then we can meaningfully make policy that will address them. So additionally, these disparities are not just in who we charge, but they're also in who we choose to believe. So and the same jurisdiction that I've been talking about that opened their books found that when a person who has experienced domestic violence is a person of color, that prosecutors were less likely to charge the perpetrator when they were white, and especially so in these crimes of domestic violence. So tangentially, so when we get to police use of force cases, it's a different but very related problem. This office does publicly track use of force callouts, but it has only charged one officer in the last several years. And this was during an era where Phoenix had the highest rate of police shootings in the entire nation. So I am committed to the creation of an independent unit that will evaluate use of force cases with community involvement and apart from the conflict of interest that's really inherent in that relationship between prosecutors and law enforcement. So in short, we have a system that is made up of humans, and those humans carry bias. We know that data is the key to getting in and addressing these racial disparities, but we need courageous and transparent leadership if we're going to get it done.
Thank you, Julie. So the last question is going to a completely different part of the office, but one that doesn't get enough visibility, the civil division. The Maricopa County Attorney's Office has a civil division as well. Tell us more about your priority objectives for the civil division.
Yes, and to push back, it's not that the civil division doesn't get visibility, it's also that it's been routinely ignored and has been historically a place where the friends of the county attorney serve. But make no mistake about it, this part of the office is really important because it affects county residents' day-to-day lives. Issues that are essential to the functioning of democracy, for example, like elections, public records requests, open meeting laws, those all come through the civil division. When a corporation breaks environmental laws, the enforcement action comes through the civil division. When a county agency gets sued, it comes through this portion of the office. So specifically, looking at the civil division and its organization, the different practice groups that are therein, the grouping it doesn't make sense to me. I have run both a legal clinic and my own law firm and have more civil experience than anyone else running. And I can tell you that structuring practice groups around subject matter would make this part of the office so much more efficient and would promote the institutional knowledge that is so key when you're out there advising clients. But more to your point, when you have an office that has been both politicized and ignored, it's fair to see why morale in that portion of the office would be low. And my commitment to the attorneys of this office is to make the Maricopa County Attorney's Office the best place to serve in the county. I got into prosecution because I believe in public service. In particular, I was driven because I watched friends and family report intimate partner violence and sexual assault and get referred into like bureaucratic oblivion. And I want those who share that heart for public service to be in a workplace that's better, a workplace where sexual harassment isn't tolerated, where there is equal pay for equal work, where leaders are promoted based on merit and not friendship, where their bureau chiefs are as diverse as the community that we serve, and where they're supported to do that truly excellent work and believe that their work has meaning and has purpose. So those are my priorities for the civil division and for the office writ large.
Thank you, Julie. I think it's important for everyone to have the chance to hear, what your leadership means for the county attorney's office. I'm glad we had the chance to discuss this, and I know you now have a couple of minutes yourself to sum up, why this matters.
Yeah, so thank you so much for this opportunity today. Again, my name is Julie Gunnigal. Come visit me on my website and read more about how the county attorney's office can better serve you and can better serve the residents of Maricopa County by being, smarter and more fair. This office is really the most important office when it comes to effective public service and equity. And at this moment, we need someone there who is committed to removing the racial disparities that exist in prosecution, to making sure that simple reforms like stopping charging marijuana, ending cash bail, stop charge stacking within this office, and a host of the other criminal justice issues that, frankly, we just don't have time to get into today, are all placed front and center. I want people to realize the power that this office holds, because there's many issues in criminal justice that have to go through the legislature, and that's a good discussion to have, whether it's we creating expungement statutes or end mandatory minimums. But there are things that this office can do by virtue of policy on day one that can reduce our incarceration rate, that can prioritize crimes of violence, crimes that target women, children, and our seniors, and that target public corruption. We just need someone in this office who has the political will to do it. As an experienced prosecutor, I believe that I'm the person who can best address the systemic inequities that are in this system and hold those in power responsible, not just when they create systems like our private prison and school to prison pipeline, but when they steal our public funds. And that is the way that we have to address some of the systemic problems in Arizona, because we're never going to have the kind of education, the kind of public health, the kind of healthcare and infrastructure investment until we address the corruption that happens in our county. So please visit me at gunnigal2020.com, reach out on Facebook or Twitter. I am so happy to answer your questions. And January, I am so grateful for all the leadership that you've given to Arizona on so many of these issues.
Thank you, Julie. Good to see you, Will.
Thank you so much, January. It's good to be here. It's good to see you. Do you mind if I take my coat off?
No, please do. And so we have this time together. I'll ask you 4 questions that, our conversation and those questions are designed to really let voters know, A, the opportunity we have to bring new leadership to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. And B, what does your leadership bring to the table? What is your vision? In these different areas that the county attorney's office actually has so much impact over. So first, we'll give you a couple of minutes to introduce yourself to all the voters who are turning in.
Thank you so much, January. Again, I can't thank you enough. It's great to be here in such good company and to have this platform. For those who don't know me, my name is Will Knight. It's a pretty cool name for an office like this, but it's also a white boy name. Entonces, te prometo que soy inmigrante colombiano. And I'm running for Maricopa County Attorney because in a lot of ways I'm not supposed to. Because in America today, young Latinos who had to flee cartel violence, whose dads ended up in federal prison for selling drugs, they're not supposed to make it as far as I have. Young Latinos who get kicked out of high school, who get arrested as teenagers, don't end up sitting where I'm sitting now with an outstanding law school pedigree and the power and the privilege to be able to run for an office like this, not in spite of our backgrounds, but because of them. So I'm running because the futures of our Black and brown youth are at stake right now. It couldn't be more vivid and in front of all of our faces than it is in this moment. And if someone like me doesn't step up, then the prospects of all of our marginalized Americans will continue to turn on whether they were lucky enough to avoid getting in trouble or whether they were able to muster resources that our communities disproportionately are incapable of accessing. So I'm running because I worked hard. Sure, I graduated second in my class, and I got to peer behind the prosecutorial veil as the Truman Young Fellow. I got to work at some of the top law firms and on really important civil rights cases like marriage equality and helping exonerate the wrongly convicted. But January, you and I know that hard work isn't always enough for young men like me. Really, I got lucky. I benefit from a lot of privilege that helped me get lucky that even relatives of mine lack. I'm a little güerito. I do have that white boy name. I'm cisgendered, heterosexual, and I got to go to college for free in Georgia under the Hope Scholarship, which no longer exists. That helped me get a scholarship to law school. And although I was told by my elected predecessor there that my background disqualifies me from helping my community, the doors that opened for me after that helped me build a network of communities and allies who are supporting me in this fight now. For the love of God, January, I was born with the privilege of being an American citizen. So we're all up here talking about, in one form or another, my 3 platforms: that we need to end mass incarceration. We need to empower our communities with a voice in the justice process. And above all, we need to hold law enforcement accountable. Anyone can talk about these things, but I need these things. These are the reasons I became a lawyer in the first place. And right now, while our Black and brown communities are crying out in unfathomable pain, we need someone like me who understands their pain and can promise solutions that they will trust. So that's why I'm going to win this election. We are going to prioritize prevention over detention. And I will serve our entire community, not as your top cop, but as your chief justice enforcement officer.
Thank you for that, Will. So let's talk about some of these different areas. A lot of people don't know the reach of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office. And you've had the chance to answer a lot of questions over the course of the campaign, but we want to ask about some specific areas that people may not have heard as much about. And we'll start with plea policies. So you and I know that the Maricopa County Attorney's Office has, for a very long time, used strict plea policies in different settings for different crimes. Tell us about, when you get there as the county attorney, what would you identify as the top 3 plea policies that are most in urgent need of review and change? And how do you think that would make a difference for the people of Maricopa County?
This is such an important question, January, so thank you for asking it. Let me try to answer this first by explaining the power that office holds, and then I'll identify the specific policies by explaining how the office uses that power. And then I'd like to share my vision of how we can use that power more effectively to prioritize crime prevention over detention. So most people think that judges hold all the power in the criminal justice system, but as you well know, that's simply not true. It's the prosecutors today, because of the tough on crime era, because over the last 50 years, we have passed tougher and harsher laws. We've passed mandatory minimums. We've enabled our prosecutors' offices with a whole array of enhancements and aggravators and methods to stack charges and tweak the way they approach a case that sets the absolute minimum sentence way up here and strips our judges of any discretion to do anything about that. So that by the moment a defendant even walks into the courtroom for the first time, the prosecutor has already decided exactly how much prison time, the minimum amount of prison time they can get is, and the numbers are colossal, especially here in Arizona and in Maricopa County, which is the most punitive county in Arizona. We are the 4th most incarcerated state in the country because of this, and that's driven by Maricopa in this state. And the United States is currently the most incarcerated country in the history of the world because of this. Our incarceration rate in Arizona is approaching 1% right now because of this. So that power is used right now in that office. The approach is to simply charge and allege every possible thing that you can under the law. And then once you've done that, from that position of leverage and power, evaluate what the appropriate settlement should be. It is very black and white, and it doesn't take into account the actual harm that occurred in a case and what the just result should be. So there are 3 specific policies that facilitate the way that they use this power. The first 2 of them are sort of similar in that they prioritize efficiency of that office over justice. And so the first one is coercive plea cutoff deadlines. These are arbitrarily set to help prosecutors and that office avoid engaging in robust adversarial constitutional litigation, right? To avoid actually working up their cases, understanding their strength, and using that to understand what the just result should be. The second is any policy that they use to intimidate or coerce defendants into plea agreements. You've heard it time and again, I'm sure, whenever a defendant rejects a plea. This happens in early disposition courts primarily, before you have any access to discovery, to the full evidence in the case. And the prosecutors make records as a matter of policy that any future plea offers will be substantially harsher. And the only reason to do that is to intimidate and coerce people away from asserting their rights and defending themselves. And the last one is the policy of policies. It's that 15, 20-page manual that says we do this in every case. This is the standard settlement once the exposure is here because we've got the power to make it be there. We're going to throw that out day one. So how we fix this, how we prioritize prevention over detention is instead of doing things just because we can, we only do the things that we should. We focus on the harm. We focus on the best interests of the community, and we decide at the outset what the just result should be. If we don't know that at the beginning of a case, and many complicated cases like fraud cases, which were the majority of the cases I worked on, you don't know that until you've worked on it for 6 months. If you don't know at the beginning, you don't extend a settlement offer yet. You work your cases until you understand what the just result should be, and then you achieve that.
Thanks, Will. Appreciate it. So let's go to another part of the office. We hear a lot about the school to prison pipeline and how, there are trends that show when students are becoming involved with the juvenile justice system, how much more likely it is that they will then be involved with the criminal justice system. And how do we address that? Most people agree it's not okay. When you look at the juvenile justice system and the Maricopa County Attorney's role in it, which many people don't understand, that leadership has a big role in how the justice system works for kids. What do you see that we can do that would, reduce fines and fees that are imposed on families who are more disproportionately impoverished to start with? What changes would you make around juvenile justice as a whole, and in particular for minors, for kids that are forced to go into adult court in Arizona? Tell us more about your vision and what your leadership would mean in those areas.
Another really important question, and thank you for acknowledging the current state of affairs there. National studies have consistently shown that Black, Latinx, Native students are disproportionately impacted by school punishment, pushed out of school, particularly young Black women, and referred to law enforcement at higher rates than their counterparts. I studied these numbers intimately because I sit on the Commission on Access to Justice, which is charged with studying and reporting our juvenile justice statistics. So this is something I know a lot about. I know that Black students make up 16% of all enrolled students, but somehow they account for 31% of all in-school arrests. And that happens anyway when documentable offenses like smoking or vandalism are committed at the exact same rates by their white counterparts. It's the subjective discipline, things like disrespect of authority, that are disproportionately leveraged against minority and students of color. Zero tolerance policies contribute to that as well. So the specific questions you asked, first, what can I do to alleviate fines and fees? We absolutely should be waiving fines and fees out of the gate whenever we have discretion to do though, because justice shouldn't have a price tag. And where we do not have discretion, where the law requires fines and fees be imposed, then the county can and should be indemnifying our poor, our indigent communities who can't afford these fines and fees. And when we stop using our felony courts to try and solve all of the social problems that we are facing, to stop solving the opioid epidemic by warehousing people, when we do this under my comprehensive decarceration plan to achieve 50% less contributions to jails and prisons, we're going to save $400 million every year. And we can then use that to fund equitable programs that can help families pay fines and fees when they are in the system like that. The second important question you asked is what changes can I make to prosecuting juveniles in adult court? Well, I have committed on the record unequivocally from the beginning that whenever this office has discretion, we will never transfer juveniles into adult courts. There's broad scientific consensus, regardless of anyone's political background or beliefs, that juveniles, all the way to age 25, the brain is not fully developed, particularly in young men, and young people have so much capacity to rehabilitate, to reform, and such less capacity to appreciate the consequences of their actions. I've seen this personally in many clients that I've represented. A 16-year-old client that was charged with arson and prosecuted as an adult because of it. When we act like clever lawyers and try to achieve justice, then we don't have to charge those mandatory juvenile transfer offenses that could have been charged as criminal damage, and we could have achieved justice more effectively in that case. That's my promise and that's my commitment.
Thank you, Will. So the next question is about transparency and data. Most people can see trends, whether it's racial disparities in charging, sentencing, whether it's unlawful use of force. People can see trends that should make all of us uncomfortable. And the question is, for you, what will you do with data like that? And how can you use data to actually start to address some of the problems we have, like racial disparities and unlawful use of force?
Another really important issue, only 24% of our prosecutors' offices nationwide have robust and publicly available data like this, and it's critically important to help us study and address disparate impacts and over-criminalization, over-policing, particularly in minority communities. Are you familiar with the concept of million-dollar blocks? This was a study conducted by Columbia University about 10 years ago, where they used grant funding. They looked at our predominantly minority communities, and they looked at the people going to prisons, and we calculated exactly how many millions of dollars we're spending per city block in those particular communities to send people to prison. When you overlay that with a map of just non-white population density in Phoenix, it's almost the exact same map. So that data has helped us understand the racial impact and the overcriminalization of poor Black and brown communities, but we shouldn't have to wait until Columbia University has the funds and the resources to study that. When we have this data now, we should make it publicly available on the internet, like Larry Krasner's already done in Philadelphia, like prosecutors across this country who truly understand that the light of transparency is the disinfectant that we need to solve a lot of the problems that we're facing. So when we do that, we will invite our community partners, our policy institutes, our academics to help us study and tackle these specific shortfalls that the data will help us identify. So that's one critically important thing that we can do. One policy idea that we had based on looking at this data is that we can create structural changes in this office to eliminate implicit biases that are resulting in disproportionate impacts. You know that Black and brown people are typically charged more frequently and with more serious offenses and more offenses than their white counterparts. Well, we create an independent walled-off intake division to take submittals from law enforcement agencies, to redact any indication of race and ethnicity, and to redact the names of suspects, give the information to the charging prosecutor that they need to make an informed decision out of the gate. And then once that decision is made in a vacuum, then we unredact it and we move on with the case. That's a structural change. I don't believe you can train racism away or implicit bias away, but we can structurally change it. And we only get there if we study the data and the shortfalls. That idea came from studying this effect in the employment sector. And that's another thing we're going to do in that office to empower Black and brown people as well, is blind hiring policies. But in addition to that, open file discovery, accessibility to the defendant and the defendant's attorney, and community oversight. Having our community oversight board is one of my platforms right there, right? Good timing. And having the community's input on these data metrics that we're going to be making publicly available and inviting them to study is going to be how we address so many of the problems that are driving the protests right now, and rightly so.
Thank you, Will. So our last question takes us to a part of the office that doesn't get as much visibility, but we have this chance for new leadership in the county attorney's office, and the civil division of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office can be better used for the people of Maricopa County. We know that. Tell us more about your priority objectives for the civil division of the Maricopa County Attorney's Office under your leadership.
Thank you, January. And a brief history lesson that I think you lived and were a part of. The civil division of that office was once incredibly corrupted by a former county attorney, and there were some struggles with reforming it. Some folks are out here, unfortunately, spreading some misinformation that the county attorney's office no longer has a civil division because of that dark period that was driven by Andrew Thomas, Joe Arpaio, and Russell Pierce. That's not the case. One thing that I do have to give my elected predecessor some credit for is that he rebuilt that part of the office, and it's critically important. Our county attorney is the county's chief civil legal officer. It represents our county agencies in state and federal litigation. There are 5 specific divisions and 32 lawyers in there, although one minor aside, only 1 Black lawyer, and that's got to change. But 32 attorneys working on everything from government advice to human resources to land use and transactional practice. I have a background in civil and commercial litigation. So I have a lot of perspective to bring to the table here that office has lacked for far too long. Sheriff Penzone, for example. Sheriff Penzone deserves a good lawyer who understands civil rights litigation, because a good civil defense lawyer, as you know, earns the trust of their client, develops a rapport with their client, and when bad things happen and their client is responsible, doesn't just zealously defend that single case. They often advise their client when they've done wrong that we need to make it right. And more importantly, we need to make sure it doesn't ever happen again. So they can advise their client how to avoid civil rights lawsuits. And that's my vision for Sheriff Penzone. I want Adrian Fontes to have an ally in that office who will defend him in court when our Republican Attorney General sues him to prevent him from sending mail-in ballots to everybody who's registered to vote during a pandemic for public health reasons. So it's critically important to have a county attorney who understands these things and has a vision of how we can use that section of the office to help us achieve justice. And that's another asset that I bring to the table.
Great, thank you, Will. Okay, so that's our time. I'm glad we had the chance to spend this time together and for people to learn more about, what you're bringing to the table, what your leadership would mean. And now you have a couple of minutes to provide closing remarks to voters to, again, help them understand what your leadership means.
Thank you, January, and thank you for your time. This has been wonderful. Let me just close by saying that this campaign has always been about so much more than a candidate, more than just me or even a single office. In fact, my wife was the first person who suggested I should run, and my initial reaction was no. I never had a plan for this. So when we decided to do this, it was because this campaign had to be about a movement, about a long-awaited nationwide movement that we're seeing now. to end the tyranny of mass incarceration, to hold law enforcement accountable, and to restore consent of the governed by empowering our community with a voice in how we police and prosecute. When I talk about impacted communities, I'm speaking from my heart because I am a member of those most impacted communities. I am directly impacted. I am a Latino immigrant, and I understand the collateral consequences, the devastating collateral consequences of prison sentences on families and on communities. I understand what it means to be otherized and criminalized and told that you're less than for the rest of your life, long after accepting responsibility for a mistake. So those are the reasons I'm here in the first place. And I didn't ask to be, but they have all made me the right candidate for this office right now in this historic moment. I'm the only candidate in this race who has lived the systemic interaction between the greatest inequities that we're facing, who truly understands the historic racist economic link between the school to prison pipeline and mass incarceration. I truly understand the relationship between reproductive justice and racial justice from my own family's journey. And I truly understand the connection between income inequality, healthcare access, and the criminalization of our most vulnerable communities. Most importantly, I truly understand that Black Lives Matter. So in this incredible moment where we have such a movement of solidarity, a movement demanding justice from our government, we also need to reflect back to 2016 when we had more than 500,000 Black, Latinx, Native American voters, eligible voters here in Maricopa County who didn't vote. And why would we? In our 150-year history as a county, we have never once had a Black or Latino or Native county attorney. Yet we are 32% of the population here in Maricopa. So of course our communities are marginalized. Of course our communities are disenfranchised and less engaged. But when somebody from those communities promises justice and understands their struggle, it will motivate and mobilize those voters that we need, not just to win this critically important election, but to win all the other critically important elections coming up this November. So we are building a movement, and I am here to serve our community as their Chief Justice Enforcement Officer in that movement.
Thank you, Will.
Thank you, January.
Thank you to all of our candidates and to you for being informed voters. We hope you learned more about them and how important it is to bring new leadership to this office this year. Thank you.